"He's everything you'll never be," she said about our neighbor. So I packed her bags that weekend. The neighbor called her desperate, she lost all her friends, and I finally found peace. Looking back now, I can see the warning signs were there all along, but when you're 3 years deep into what you think is a solid relationship, you tend to miss the cracks in the foundation. I'm Carter, 31, been a firefighter with Austin Fire Department for 8 years now, and until recently I thought I had my life figured out with Jessica, a real estate agent who seemed to appreciate the kind of man I was. We'd been together since she moved into the neighborhood 3 years ago, and I genuinely believed we were building something real in our little corner of suburban Austin. I'm the kind of guy who shows up when he says he will, helps neighbors fix their sprinkler systems on weekends, volunteers for the annual community safety fair, and never misses one of Jessica's open houses because I knew how important her career was to her. She used to brag to her friends about having a real man who actually served his community, someone dependable who didn't just talk about helping others but actually did it every single day. Our street was one of those tight-knit neighborhoods where everyone knew each other's names, where we'd have impromptu barbecues in someone's backyard every few weeks, and where the annual block party was genuinely something people looked forward to. Jessica and I were the couple everyone could count on. I'd bring the grill and the fire safety reminders, she'd bring the charm and the inside scoop on which houses might be going up for sale soon. We hosted game nights, helped organize the neighborhood watch program, and Jessica always made sure our yard looked perfect because presentation matters in real estate. I thought we complemented each other perfectly. She brought social energy and ambition, I brought stability and genuine care for the people around us. The neighbors loved us, especially the older couples who appreciated having a firefighter right on their street, and Jessica seemed proud to be with someone they all respected and trusted. I remember thinking during last year's 4th of July block party, watching Jessica laugh with the neighbors while I manned the grill, that this was exactly the kind of life I wanted, rooted, meaningful, surrounded by good people who actually cared about each other. She'd grab my arm during conversations, introduce me as my firefighter, and I felt like we were genuinely partners building something lasting together in a community that valued the same things we did. Everything changed the day Ethan moved into the house next door with his wife and 2 young kids. I was at work when the moving truck arrived, but Jessica called me during my shift, practically bubbling with excitement about our interesting new neighbors. She'd apparently spent the entire morning watching the movers carry inexpensive furniture and what looked like high-end electronics, and she couldn't stop talking about the sleek black Tesla in the driveway and the professional landscaping crew that showed up the same afternoon. When I got home that evening, Jessica was practically vibrating with curiosity, pointing out how the new guy had already installed smart outdoor lighting and was setting up what looked like a home office in the front room. "He's some kind of tech entrepreneur," she told me, having somehow extracted this information during a brief introduction. "Works from home, travels for business, just moved here from California for a fresh start." Within a week, I started noticing Jessica's sudden interest in yard work coinciding perfectly with Ethan's morning routine. She'd never been much for early morning anything, but suddenly she was up at 6:30, coffee in hand, watering plants that didn't need watering while Ethan went for his daily run. "He's so disciplined," she'd comment, watching him stretch on his front porch. "Look how he just commits to that routine every single day." Then came the observations about his landscaping projects. Every weekend, Ethan would be outside doing something, installing new flower beds, building a custom deck, setting up an elaborate outdoor kitchen area that probably cost more than my truck. Jessica would find reasons to be in our front yard, pruning bushes that were already perfectly trimmed, just to watch him work. "Did you see how he just dove into that deck project?" she'd ask me. No permits, no endless planning, just saw what he wanted and made it happen. The way she said it felt pointed, like a subtle criticism of my more methodical approach to home improvements. During neighborhood gatherings, Jessica would gravitate toward conversations about Ethan's latest projects, asking detailed questions about his renovation timeline and his decision-making process. Ethan completely renovated his kitchen in one weekend, she'd announce to whoever would listen. Can you believe that? Most people would spend months planning something like that. She'd learned that he'd negotiated directly with the HOA to get approval for his deck modifications, somehow charming the board into fast-tracking his requests when other neighbors had waited months for similar approvals. "He just knows how to take charge of a situation," Jessica would say with obvious admiration. "Some people just have that natural confidence, you know?" I started paying closer attention to her schedule, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. Our dog Max, who'd always been walked sporadically whenever Jessica felt like it, suddenly had a very regular schedule that happened to align perfectly with Ethan's outdoor activities. Morning walks at 7 when he left for his run, evening walks at 6 when he got home from business trips, weekend walks that somehow always involved multiple passes by his driveway when he was washing his car or working on projects. What started as innocent admiration quickly morphed into something that felt like a constant performance review of my life, with Ethan as the gold standard I was apparently failing to meet. Jessica's comments became sharper, more pointed, always framed as helpful observations about how things could be better if I just approached them differently. When our bathroom faucet started leaking and I suggested we save up for a few months to do a proper renovation instead of just patching it, Jessica let out this exaggerated sigh that had become her signature response to my practical suggestions. "You know, Ethan just redid his entire master bathroom in 2 weeks," she said, scrolling through what I assumed were pictures he'd shared in the neighborhood group chat. "He saw what he wanted, made a decision, and just went for it instead of overthinking everything to death." The way she said overthinking made it sound like a character flaw, like my tendency to research contractors and compare quotes was somehow evidence of weakness rather than basic financial responsibility. During neighborhood gatherings, the comparisons became more public and more humiliating. At the monthly block party, I'd set up a fire safety demonstration for the kids, something I'd been doing for 2 years that parents genuinely appreciated. This time, Jessica spent the entire presentation standing with a group of neighbors, loudly praising Ethan's confidence during his recent HOA board meeting presentation about neighborhood security upgrades. "He just commands attention when he speaks," she announced, her voice carrying over my explanation of fire escape plans. "Some people just have that natural leadership presence, you know?" When I finished my presentation and walked over to join the conversation, Jessica barely acknowledged my contribution to the community event we were literally hosting in our backyard. Instead, she immediately launched into more details about Ethan's proposal for upgraded street lighting, describing his PowerPoint slides and professional presentation style like she'd been taking notes. "He doesn't just talk about making things better," she said, glancing at me meaningfully. "He actually follows through with real solutions." The subtle digs became a constant soundtrack to our daily life. When I suggested we take time to research vacation destinations before booking our spring trip, Jessica would mention how Ethan and his family had spontaneously decided to spend a long weekend in Colorado and just booked it that same day. "Must be nice to be secure enough to just make decisions without analyzing every possible scenario," she'd say, making spontaneity sound like courage and my careful planning sound like cowardice. Even my work schedule became fair game for comparison. When I picked up extra shifts to help cover for a colleague going through a difficult divorce, Jessica complained that I was never around anymore, then immediately contrasted it with how Ethan managed to work from home while still being available for his family. "He's figured out that work-life balance thing," she'd observe. "Some people just know how to prioritize what actually matters." It didn't matter that my extra shifts were helping a friend in crisis or that firefighting doesn't exactly offer the luxury of working from a home office. Jessica had found her measuring stick, and I was coming up short in every category. The breaking point came during our annual summer barbecue, an event Jessica had been planning for weeks and that I'd been genuinely looking forward to as a chance to reconnect with our neighbors and maybe recapture some of the easy camaraderie we used to share. I'd spent the afternoon prepping the grill, setting up tables in our backyard, and making sure we had enough seating for everyone who'd RSVP'd. Jessica had been drinking wine since 3 o'clock, claiming she needed to take the edge off her hosting anxiety, but I could tell the alcohol was making her bolder, more willing to say things she usually kept as pointed looks or subtle comments. By the time our neighbors started arriving around 5, Jessica was already 3 glasses deep and holding court near the patio, regaling Sarah and Mike from down the street with stories about Ethan's latest home improvement projects. "You should see what he's done with his backyard," she was saying, gesturing dramatically with her wine glass. "Complete outdoor kitchen, built-in seating, professional-grade lighting. The man just sees what he wants and makes it happen." When Tom and Linda joined the conversation, Jessica immediately steered the discussion toward Ethan's recent business trip to Seattle and how he'd managed to negotiate some major contract while he was there. "He was telling me about it yesterday morning during our chat by the mailboxes," she said, and I noticed she made sure to emphasize that they'd been having regular conversations. Some people just have that entrepreneurial mindset, you know? They see opportunities everywhere instead of just accepting whatever situation they're handed. I was manning the grill, trying to focus on not burning anyone's burger, but Jessica's voice carried across the yard with increasing volume and decreasing filter. When our neighbor Dave mentioned that he'd been thinking about starting a side business, Jessica immediately launched into more details about Ethan's success story, comparing his risk-taking mentality to people who play it safe their whole lives and wonder why nothing exciting ever happens to them. The comment felt like a direct shot, especially delivered in front of our friends, but I tried to redirect the conversation by asking Dave about his business idea. That's awesome, man. What kind of timeline are you thinking? I called over from the grill. Jessica barely let Dave answer before jumping back in with more Ethan commentary. You know what I love about confident people? They don't need to overthink every single decision. Ethan told me he basically decided to move here after one weekend trip to Austin. Can you imagine just trusting your instincts like that? She looked directly at me while saying it, her eyes bright with wine and something that looked like challenge. Some people spend months researching and planning and analyzing every possible outcome, but real leaders just know what they want and go after it. The conversation continued like this for another hour, with Jessica finding increasingly obvious ways to work Ethan's name into every topic while simultaneously taking shots at what she clearly saw as my overcautious approach to life. When Linda complimented our garden and mentioned that Jessica must have a green thumb, Jessica immediately credited her recent gardening inspiration to watching someone who actually knows how to take charge of outdoor projects. When Mike asked about our vacation plans, Jessica sighed about how some people like to plan everything 6 months in advance instead of just being spontaneous and adventurous. By 8 o'clock, most of our neighbors had headed home, citing early work schedules or babysitter curfews, and I found myself cleaning up the aftermath of what should have been a fun community gathering but had felt more like a public referendum on my inadequacy as a man. Jessica was still nursing her wine, now sitting on our patio furniture scrolling through her phone, probably looking at more pictures of Ethan's latest projects. That was a good party, she said without looking up. Everyone seemed to have fun. I was stacking plates and loading the dishwasher, trying to process the evening and figure out how to address what had felt like 3 hours of public humiliation disguised as casual conversation. Jessica, we need to talk about tonight, I said, keeping my voice level. What happened out there wasn't okay. She finally looked up from her phone, and I could see that familiar defensive expression settling across her face. What are you talking about? I was just making conversation with our friends. You spent the entire evening talking about Ethan while basically telling everyone within earshot that I'm some kind of boring, overcautious loser who can't make decisions. That's not what I said. It's exactly what you said. In front of our neighbors. People who've known us for 3 years. Jessica set down her wine glass harder than necessary, the sound sharp against the patio table. God, Carter, you're being so sensitive. I can't help it if other people are more interesting to talk about than your work schedule and your endless planning sessions. More interesting? Jessica, you brought up Ethan's name at least 15 times tonight. You couldn't get through a single conversation without comparing me to him. Maybe because the comparison isn't exactly flattering for you. The words hung in the air between us, sharp and cruel and more honest than anything she'd said in months. I stopped loading the dishwasher and turned to look at her directly. What's that supposed to mean? It means exactly what you think it means. Jessica stood up, swaying slightly, her inhibitions completely dissolved by wine and months of building resentment. He's everything you'll never be, Carter. Successful, confident, exciting. He takes risks, makes things happen, doesn't spend 3 months researching which contractor to hire for a simple bathroom repair. Her voice was getting louder, more vicious with each word. If he wanted me, I'd leave you tomorrow without looking back. Hell, I'd probably pack tonight if I thought he was interested. The statement hit me like a physical blow, not because it was surprising, but because it was so brutally honest that it stripped away any pretense that we were having a normal relationship argument. This wasn't about communication or different perspectives on home improvement projects. This was Jessica telling me that she'd already decided I wasn't enough and was just waiting for a better option to present itself. I stood there for a long moment, dish towel still in my hands, Looking at this woman I'd spent 3 years loving and supporting and building a life with, realizing that somewhere along the way she'd stopped seeing me as a partner and started seeing me as a placeholder. "Okay," I said quietly, setting the towel on the counter. "I heard you loud and clear." She seemed taken aback by my calm response, probably expecting me to argue or beg or promise to change. Instead, I finished loading the dishwasher, turned it on, and walked outside to sit on our front porch, staring across at Ethan's perfectly manicured lawn while processing the fact that my relationship had just ended not with a discussion or a mutual decision, but with Jessica basically announcing that she was already emotionally checked out and just waiting for her upgrade to become available. I woke up at 5:30 the next morning, which was earlier than usual but felt right given the clarity I'd found sitting on that porch until nearly midnight. Jessica was still passed out in our bedroom, probably going to wake up with a brutal hangover and hopefully some regret about the things she'd said, but I wasn't interested in waiting around for apologies or explanations that would just be damage control anyway. She'd shown me exactly who she was and what she really thought of our relationship, and I was finally ready to listen. I started in the closet, methodically folding her clothes and placing them in the suitcases I'd pulled from our storage room. 3 years of shared living space meant her belongings were mixed in with mine throughout the house, but I'd always been detail-oriented, and this morning that trait served me well as I worked through each room with the systematic approach I used for equipment checks at the fire station. Her jewelry box from the dresser, the expensive skincare products that took up half our bathroom counter, the stack of real estate magazines she kept on her nightstand but never actually read. Each item went into boxes or suitcases with the same care I'd use for inventory management at work, not out of lingering affection, but because doing things properly was just who I was, even when ending a relationship with someone who'd made it clear she didn't value that quality. By 9 o'clock, I had 4 suitcases packed and 3 cardboard boxes filled with miscellaneous items, all arranged neatly in our living room like a well-organized staging area. I was loading her coffee maker into the final box when I heard Jessica stumble out of the bedroom, probably drawn by the sound of movement and the absence of her usual Saturday morning coffee routine. "What the hell are you doing?" she asked, her voice rough with sleep and dehydration, squinting at the collection of luggage like she couldn't quite process what she was seeing. "It's pretty obvious what I'm doing," I said, continuing to wrap her coffee maker in a dish towel. "I'm packing your things." "Carter, what are you talking about? Why are my clothes in suitcases?" She moved closer to the living room, now fully awake and starting to look genuinely confused rather than just hungover. "You were very clear last night about your priorities and your feelings about our relationship. I'm just helping you transition to whatever comes next." I kept my voice calm and matter-of-fact, the same tone I'd use for briefing new recruits about safety protocols. Jessica stared at the suitcases for another moment, then let out a laugh that sounded forced and nervous. "Oh my God, Carter, you're being completely ridiculous. I was drunk last night. People say stupid things when they've been drinking. You can't seriously be this upset about some silly comments I made at a party." "Silly comments?" I stopped packing and looked at her directly. "You told me that if Ethan wanted you, you'd leave me tomorrow without looking back. You said he's everything I'll never be." "Those weren't silly comments, Jessica. That was you telling me exactly how you feel. I was being dramatic. You know how I get when I've had too much wine. I didn't mean any of that stuff." She was moving into damage control mode now, her voice taking on that placating tone she used when she wanted to smooth over conflicts without actually addressing them. "I think you meant every word of it. And honestly, I think you've been meaning it for months. Last night was just the first time you were drunk enough to say it out loud." Jessica's expression shifted from confusion to irritation, probably realizing that her usual deflection tactics weren't going to work this time. "So what? You're just going to throw away 3 years because of one argument? That's your solution?" "I'm not throwing anything away. You already did that when you decided I wasn't good enough and started shopping around for my replacement." I went back to packing, adding her expensive face masks and the organic shampoo she special ordered online. "This isn't shopping around, Carter. This is you completely overreacting to a stupid fight and making decisions when you're angry." "I'm not angry, Jessica. I'm done. There's a difference." The finality in my voice must have registered because her tone changed again, becoming more urgent, more desperate. "Okay, fine, maybe I said some things I shouldn't have said. Maybe I've been frustrated with some aspects of our relationship. But that doesn't mean I want to break up. We can work on this stuff. No, we can't work on this. You want someone different than who I am. You want someone like Ethan, and that's never going to be me. I'm not going to spend the next however many years trying to turn myself into your ideal man while you resent me for not being exciting enough. I closed the final box and stacked it with the others. You have until Sunday evening to get all of this out of here. I'm going to stay at the station this weekend, so you can move everything without having to deal with me being around. Sunday evening? Carter, that's completely unreasonable. Where am I supposed to go on such short notice? I don't know, Jessica, and frankly, that's not my problem to solve anymore. You're a capable adult with a real estate license and plenty of connections. Figure it out. The harshness of my words seemed to shock her, probably because I'd spent 3 years being accommodating and supportive, always willing to help solve her problems or smooth over difficulties. You're being cruel, she said, and for the first time that morning, she sounded genuinely hurt rather than just defensive. I'm being honest. For the first time in months, maybe years, I'm being completely honest about what I want and what I'm willing to accept. I grabbed my keys and wallet from the kitchen counter. I already talked to my captain this morning. I'm going to pick up some extra training shifts and help with equipment maintenance. When I come back Sunday night, I expect you and all your belongings to be gone. Carter, please. Can we just sit down and talk about this like adults? I know I messed up last night, but we can fix this. We've been together for 3 years. That has to count for something. She was following me toward the front door now, her voice taking on a pleading quality I'd never heard before. It counted for something right up until you told me you'd leave me for the neighbor without looking back. That's when it stopped counting. I paused at the door and turned to look at her one more time, standing there in her pajamas surrounded by packed suitcases, probably realizing for the first time that her words actually had consequences. You know what the really sad part is? If you just talked to me about being unhappy or wanting changes in our relationship, we probably could have worked something out. But instead, you spent months making me feel inadequate while fantasizing about someone else. That's not a relationship problem, Jessica. That's a character problem. I left her standing there in our living room, surrounded by the evidence of our shared life packed up and ready to go, and drove to the fire station feeling lighter than I had in months, ready to spend the weekend doing work that actually mattered with people who respected what I brought to the table. The fallout from Jessica's weekend of reckoning spread through our neighborhood faster than I could have imagined, thanks to her spectacularly misguided attempt to turn her fantasy into reality. According to Sarah, who filled me in later with a mixture of concern and barely contained gossip, Jessica had apparently spent Sunday morning working up the courage to approach Ethan directly, convinced that my sudden exit meant she was finally free to pursue what she'd been wanting all along. She waited until Monday morning, timing her approach to coincide with Ethan's regular 7 o'clock run, positioning herself by her mailbox with what Sarah described as obviously calculated casualness. When Ethan jogged past, Jessica called out a cheerful good morning and asked if he had a few minutes to chat about neighborhood dynamics and some changes happening in the area. Ethan, being polite, stopped his run and walked over, probably expecting some routine HOA discussion or community event planning. Instead, Jessica launched into what Sarah later described as a painfully obvious attempt at flirtation, suggesting they grab coffee sometime to discuss how the neighborhood's social structure might be evolving, and mentioning that she was newly single and looking forward to getting to know people better. The rejection was swift and brutal. Ethan, who'd apparently been increasingly uncomfortable with Jessica's attention over the past few months, didn't bother with polite deflection. Jessica, I need to be very direct with you, he said, loud enough that Sarah could hear from her own driveway where she was loading her kids into the car for school. Your behavior toward me has been inappropriate for months. I'm happily married, I love my wife, and I'm not interested in any kind of relationship with you beyond basic neighborly politeness. You need to respect those boundaries. Jessica tried to backtrack, claiming she'd been misunderstood and was just being friendly, but Ethan cut her off. There's nothing friendly about the way you've been timing your activities around my schedule or the comments you've been making about my marriage and my family. It stops now. The entire exchange lasted maybe 3 minutes, but Sarah witnessed every excruciating second of it, and by noon that day, the story had made its way through the neighborhood women's group chat with the kind of speed usually reserved for genuine emergencies. The consensus was swift and merciless. Jessica had thrown away a good man for a married neighbor who wanted absolutely nothing to do with her, and the desperation of her approach had revealed a side of her personality that made everyone deeply uncomfortable. Within a week, the social invitations stopped coming. Jessica was conspicuously absent from the monthly book club meeting, uninvited to the impromptu girls' night that Linda organized, and excluded from the group text chain where the neighborhood women coordinated everything from babysitting swaps to restaurant recommendations. The community that had once admired her confidence and social energy now saw her as fundamentally untrustworthy, someone who would destroy a good relationship for a fantasy and then embarrass herself pursuing a married man. Her real estate business, which had relied heavily on neighborhood referrals and word-of-mouth recommendations, began suffering almost immediately. 2 potential clients who lived in nearby developments canceled consultations after hearing about the drama from mutual friends, and the listing appointment she'd been courting with the elderly couple 3 streets over mysteriously went to a different agent. In a tight-knit community where reputation mattered and people talked, Jessica had managed to destroy years of professional relationship building in a matter of days, all because she couldn't keep her personal chaos separate from her business dealings. 3 months later, I ran into Jessica at the H-E-B on Barton Springs Road, and the transformation was startling enough that I almost didn't recognize her at first. I was picking up groceries after my shift, still in my lieutenant uniform since I'd gotten promoted the week before, when I spotted someone in the produce section who looked familiar but somehow diminished. It was Jessica, but a version of her I'd never seen before, hollow-eyed, 20 pounds lighter, wearing clothes that looked like they came from Target instead of the boutiques she used to frequent. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, no makeup, none of the polished presentation that had once been her signature. She saw me at the same moment I recognized her, and I watched her face cycle through surprise, embarrassment, and what looked like genuine desperation before settling on a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Carter," she said, abandoning her cart of generic groceries to walk over. "Hi. You look really good. The uniform suits you." I nodded politely, the way I'd acknowledge any acquaintance from my past. "Thanks. How are you doing, Jessica?" The question seemed to break something in her composure, and I watched her struggle to maintain the pretense that everything was fine. "I'm doing okay, just adjusting to some changes. I heard you got promoted. Lieutenant, right? That's amazing. You always deserved more recognition for the work you do." Her voice had a brittle quality, like someone trying very hard to sound normal while everything was falling apart. "I appreciate that. Are you still in real estate?" "Sort of. It's been a challenging market lately." She wasn't meeting my eyes, and I could tell there was a story behind that vague answer that probably involved the professional consequences of her neighborhood reputation. "I've actually been doing some soul-searching lately, thinking about mistakes I've made and people I've hurt." Here it comes, I thought, recognizing the setup for what was clearly going to be an apology designed to test whether I'd be interested in reconciliation. "I owe you a huge apology, Carter. What I said that night, the way I treated you toward the end of our relationship, it was horrible and unfair and you didn't deserve any of it." She was looking directly at me now, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I was going through something, questioning everything about my life and my choices, and I took it out on you instead of dealing with my own issues. I think maybe I was testing us, to see if what we had was strong enough to survive some rough patches, and I went about it in the worst possible way." I listened to her explanation, noting how she framed her cruelty as some kind of relationship test rather than the simple truth that she'd found someone she thought was better and had been cruel enough to tell me so. "I miss us," she continued when I didn't respond immediately. "I miss what we had, the stability, the way you always made me feel safe and cared for. I know I messed up badly, but I've learned so much about myself these past few months, and I think we could build something even stronger if you'd be willing to try again." The offer hung between us in the fluorescent lighting of the grocery store, and I realized with something approaching wonder that I felt absolutely nothing about it. No anger at her manipulation, no satisfaction at her obvious desperation, no temptation to gloat about how her pursuit of Ethan had backfired so spectacularly. Just complete indifference towards someone who'd once shared my bed and my future but had revealed herself to be fundamentally incompatible with everything I valued about partnership and loyalty. "I appreciate the apology, Jessica, and I hope you figure out whatever you're going through," I said honestly. "But I'm not interested in trying again. I'm in a good place now, and I'm dating someone who actually wants to be with me." I didn't mention that the someone was Emma, A nurse from the hospital who laughed at my terrible jokes, appreciated my methodical approach to planning weekend trips, and had never once made me feel like I needed to apologize for being who I was. "Oh," Jessica said, and I watched her face crumple slightly. "Well, I hope she makes you happy. You deserve to be happy." "Thank you. I hope you find what you're looking for too." I meant it genuinely, not because I had any residual feelings for her, but because holding on to resentment seemed like a waste of energy better spent on the life I was actually building. As I walked away toward the checkout line, I felt something I hadn't expected: gratitude. Gratitude that Jessica's cruelty had forced me to recognize my own worth, gratitude that her betrayal had freed me to find someone who actually appreciated the qualities she'd found boring, and gratitude that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the best thing that could have happened. The woman who'd once made me feel inadequate had inadvertently led me to a promotion, a better relationship, and a clearer understanding of what I actually wanted from life, and for that unexpected gift, I was genuinely thankful.